They said the house had good bones, but nobody mentioned the ghosts that live inside walls built with human intention. You can't hear them at first, not until someone tries to take what's yours. Then the air starts to hum like the structure itself is listening. That hum began the night my son-in-law decided my piece was his property. "My parents are moving in with you," he said like it was law. I smiled because men who try to own others always mistake silence for surrender. But the truth? Silence is the sound of calculation. I let him walk away thinking he'd won, not knowing that he had just pulled a lever buried deep beneath his own mind, one that would expose who was truly in control. The thing about manipulation is that it never announces itself. It disguises as kindness, as family, as obligation. It speaks softly, but the roots it plants grow through generations. Cornelius thought he was fighting for space. What he didn't understand was that he was standing on the blueprint of a larger design, one built long before either of us were born. You see, every family has an architecture, roles, foundations, pressure points. Some men learn to read those structures, others are crushed beneath them. When he said his parents would move in, what he really meant was, "I am testing how far I can reach into your identity." It wasn't about rooms, it was about control. The same control that governments, corporations, and ancient orders have mastered for centuries. The art of taking without asking, dressed as virtue. That night, I sat alone in my dining room and felt something ancient stir beneath the calm. It wasn't rage, it was memory. A deep recognition that the moment you yield what is yours, you become part of someone else's design. That's how civilizations fall, not in fire, but in quiet, polite agreements. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I understood what most men never do. The enemy doesn't always break down your door. Sometimes he walks in smiling and "Cal. Alice, you dad." Morning light has a way of pretending everything is normal. It spills across the table, soft and harmless, but it doesn't erase the shadow of what was said the night before. When I woke up that day, the air in the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting. I brewed my coffee in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the steady tick of the clock, the sounds of order holding their breath before collapse. People think control is something loud, but it begins in whispers, a phrase here, a smile there, a casual suggestion that worms its way into your choices until your decisions are no longer your own. Cornelius was testing that system. He wanted to see how far he could reach into my autonomy without force. That's what predators do. They study the threshold. And most men, when confronted by polite aggression, choose peace over conflict. That's how they lose everything they've built. I stared into the dark reflection of my coffee, realizing this wasn't just about a house. It was about legacy. Who commands the space they've earned, and who gives it away because they're afraid to be called cruel? I thought about how many empires fell the same way, not by invasion but by invitation. The Romans, the Templars, the dynasties that let soft voices whisper into their walls until their pillars cracked from within. It's always the same story. Someone believes that to deny is unkind, that to protect what's theirs makes them heartless. That's how power changes hands. And I had almost done the same, almost smiled, nodded, and said yes, not because I wanted to, but because I was trained to please. Conditioned by a world that teaches men to be generous until they're hollow. But that morning, something inside me broke pattern. I realized that saying no wasn't defiance. It was reclamation, the first defense against a system built to harvest obedience. And as the sunlight hit the window frame, I saw it for what it was. Not warmth, but EXP, Osher. The beginning of a reckoning. Cornelius thought he was moving people into my house. He didn't know he'd already stepped into a lesson, one that history had been waiting centuries to teach him. That evening, the air shifted. You can feel it when power begins to rearrange itself, a pressure in the room, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm. I sat at my desk, the house silent around me, and started sketching. Not buildings this time, but boundaries. Every architect knows, before you raise a structure, you define its perimeter. You decide what stays in and what stays out. That's how civilizations are built and how they're defended. As the pencil traced lines across the page, I realized something that should terrify anyone who's ever mistaken compliance for kindness. People only take from you what you permit them to. Cornelius had measured my silence, not my resolve. He thought my stillness was submission, but it was calculation. The pause before precision. That. How true power works. It doesn't shout. It designs. It plans. It reinforces. Every empire that ever lasted longer than its enemies understood this. Emotion is noise, but structure is control. The strong man doesn't argue. He builds systems that make arguments irrelevant. That night, I reviewed everything he'd said, every gesture, every word. They were blueprints of manipulation, emotional leverage disguised as family concern. "You're alone," he'd said. "It's too much space for one man." Translation: you don't deserve what you've earned. That's how psychological control begins, by convincing you that your own peace is selfish. They weaponize empathy to dismantle sovereignty. Religion did it. Monarchies did it. Now families do it at dinner tables. But once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I closed my notebook and stared at the ceiling, tracing the invisible web of power above me. Every thread led to the same conclusion. People like Cornelius don't invade homes. They infiltrate. Them. They use love as permission slips and morality as chains. I knew then that Saturday, the day he planned to bring his parents, would not be a conflict. It would be a test, not of muscle, but of will. I would let him arrive, let him believe in victory, because only then could I show him what happens when a man stops apologizing for his own fortress. The storm wasn't coming from outside anymore, it was rising from within. Preparation doesn't begin with action. It begins with silence, the kind that hums beneath your ribs, waiting for the right second to strike. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table with my old drafting tools spread before me. Not blueprints this time, but evidence, words, timelines, facts. I was building something unseen, a structure of protection made of truth and documentation. In my world, precision is power. Emotion breaks under pressure, paperwork does not. I began to map the situation the way I'd map a skyscraper: weight, balance, stress points. Very word Cornelius had spoken was a load on the frame. I wrote them down like fault lines. My parents are moving in. Fault. You're alone. Crack. It's a waste of space. Collapse point. When you see the pattern clearly, manipulation loses its camouflage. It's not love. It's conquest in casual clothes. That's what control has always been. A psychological architecture. Ancient empires built it from marble. Modern men build it from guilt. I wasn't angry. Anger is a tool of amateurs. I was calm, surgical, deliberate. I reached out to Mitchell Crane, a retired real estate attorney, old colleague, sharper than any blade. "Need advice," I texted. "Urgent," he replied in minutes. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. That's how allies move, quiet and quick. By evening I had already printed property documents, title deeds, and a no trespass template. Cornelius thought ownership was sentiment. I knew it was law. As night deepened, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the lawn. The air outside felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Somewhere, a dog barked, then silence again. I could almost feel the house breathing, walls expanding and contracting like a living organism waiting to defend itself. That's when it hit me. Buildings are like people. They remember how they're treated. Protect them and they hold you. Surrender them and they haunt you. I whispered to the dark glass, "Not this house. Not this time." The reflection staring back wasn't just an old man anymore. It was something else. A survivor of 1,000 quiet wars, a keeper of boundaries long erased by weak men who traded peace for permission. Saturday was coming, and the design was almost complete. By the time dawn bled through the blinds, I was already awake, dressed, and driving through the empty streets. The city at sunrise feels honest. No noise, no performance, just concrete and consequence. I parked outside Mitchell Crane's office, an old brick building from another century, restored but redeemed. Inside, the air smelled of dust and leather, the scent of men who understand that words can build or destroy. Mitchell looked up from his desk, eyes sharp beneath years of wisdom. "You look like hell," he said. "Been working?" "Always," I replied. We shook hands, firm, measured, the handshake of men who understand stakes. I slid my notes across his desk. "He said his parents are moving in. Not asking, telling, this Saturday," Mitchell read in silence, the scratch of paper the only sound. "So," he said finally, "he thinks ownership is emotional. He thinks kindness is consent." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Classic play, entitlement disguised as family duty, oldest trick in civilization." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Let me tell you something most people don't understand about property, Vic. The law isn't about fairness, it's about boundaries. Whoever defines the boundaries first wins. That sentence hit harder than any sermon I'd ever heard. Boundaries define reality. A. Always have. Kingdoms, faiths, nations, families. All built on invisible lines that separate what's mine from what's yours. So what do? I asked. Mitchell smiled thinly. You make those lines visible. You post notice. You document. You prepare for trespass. He reached for a legal pad, his pen moving like a blade. If they cross your threshold without consent, the law shifts in your favor. But if you open that door even once, you surrender your fortress. He looked up. Remember that. Never open the door to control. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle like armor. Control doesn't always knock. Sometimes it smiles and waits for you to open the gate. Mitchell handed me a folder. File this with the sheriff's office. Saturday, be ready. And Vic? I looked up. Don't let them turn your peace into their entitlement. Once you yield, they'll never stop. As I stepped outside, the sun hit the street, and for the first time in weeks I felt clarity. Not comfort, but contro. By Friday morning, the air around the house felt electric, like it knew something was coming. I moved through each room deliberately, touching walls, checking locks, measuring silence. Preparation had become ritual. I wasn't just securing a home, I was reclaiming dominion. Every latch, every reinforced hinge, every printed notice on the gate, all of it was part of the architecture of defiance. I had installed new deadbolts, changed the alarm codes, and placed a discreet camera facing the driveway. Not paranoia, precision. The weak call it overreaction, the wise call it reinforcement. Civilization itself was born when the first man drew a line around his fire and said, "This is mine." That's not selfishness. It's sovereignty. Inside, I brewed coffee and sat at the table, staring at the folder Mitchell had given me. The documents were simple, direct, clean, legal, no emotion, no poetry, just power and ink. If they enter without permission, Mitchell had said, you are not confro, enting family. You are enforcing order. That sentence echoed through me like scripture. For decades, I'd mistaken endurance for strength, patience for peace. But the truth is sharper. Endurance without boundaries is surrender. Peace without defense is slavery. As I waited for the hours to pass, I noticed how still the world had become. Even the birds seemed to pause. There's a silence before every revolution, personal or political. It's the breath history takes before rewriting itself. I looked at the photos on the mantel, my late wife, my daughter, my grandson, and realized something. Love isn't proven by how much you tolerate, it's proven by what you refuse to allow. That afternoon, I stood on the porch watching the shadows stretch long across the driveway. Saturday would bring confrontation, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear belongs to the unprepared. I had built this home with my hands, now I was fortifying it with my will. Let them come. Let them bring their claims, their entitlement, their smiles. I had drawn the line, and once a line is drawn, the world divides, between those who cross it and those who never kneel again. Saturday arrived slow and heavy, the kind of morning that carries tension in its light. Even the sun seemed reluctant to rise. I woke before dawn, brewed black coffee, and stood by the window. The street outside was empty, silent, still. The world felt paused, as if it too was waiting for something irreversible. By 9, I'd showered, shaved, and dressed, not for battle, but for ceremony. That's what real confrontations are, rituals of truth. The house was immaculate, every surface clean, every door locked but one, the front. I left it unlocked on purpose, not as invitation, but as test. At 10:30, I saw their car pull into the drive. Cornelius stepped out first, smug as ever, followed by his parents. Faces carved from the same stone of entitlement. They walked as if the earth beneath them was promised, as if every door must open simply because they approached. I didn't move. I let them come to the porch, knock once, then twice. On the third knock, I opened the door, just enough for my voice to pass through. Cornelius. Dad, he said, smiling too easily. We talked about this. I told you I'd bring them by. We're moving their things in today. His tone was calm, rehearsed, dripping with false reason. The kind that sounds like care but smells like control. I said nothing. I handed him a paper instead, the notice Mitchell had prepared. He took it, frowning. What's this? Documentation, I said. As of this morning, this property is formally secured. Any entry without written consent is trespass. His father stepped forward, voice rising. You'd threaten your own family with the law? No, I said quietly. I'd protect my peace with it. Cornelius laughed, that nervous, brittle sound that cracks when arrogance meets reality. Dad, come on, this is unnecessary. Unnecessary, I repeated. Bound. Aries are only unnecessary to those who benefit from breaking them. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, and even the house seemed to hold its breath. Then Cornelius's mother said softly, "We just thought you'd want company. You shouldn't be alone." I met her eyes. Alone is not the same as abandoned. I built this home to stand, not to shelter manipulation. They shifted uneasily. The power had shifted too, silently, cleanly. No shouting, no chaos, just lines drawn and respected by force of will. Cornelius finally muttered, "We'll talk later." "No," I said, "we won't. Talking is how you reopen doors that were meant to stay closed." And then, for the first time in months, I closed the door, slowly, deliberately. The latch clicked, not as a sound of isolation, but of restoration. Behind that door, I exhaled, not in relief, but in reclamation. Peace had a sound now. It was the sound of a boundary obeyed. After the door closed, silence returned. The kind that weighs, but the kind that heals. It filled the house like light through old glass, soft and honest. I sat at the table, the same one where this all began, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel tested. The walls weren't closing in anymore, they were standing with me. I realized then that homes don't protect you, they mirror you. When you are uncertain, they creak. When you are resolved, they hold. I poured another cup of coffee, slower this time, the bitterness grounding me. Outside, the car had gone. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just retreat. Quiet, reluctant, inevitable. Power doesn't always end in noise, sometimes it ends in stillness. I looked around at the life I had rebuilt and thought about every man who had ever been told he was selfish for wanting peace, cruel for drawing lines, or ungrateful for protecting what he earned. The world trains us to believe surrender is virtue. But surrender is just a prettier word for loss. As the morning stretched, I walked room to room, the study, the living room, the workshop. Each one felt lighter. I could hear the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind at the windows. Sounds of life, not intrusion. It struck me that control isn't domination. It's clarity. It's knowing what you can stand for and what you will no longer stand through. By noon I stood in the backyard, sunlight cutting across the grass, the air warm and quiet. The same space Cornelius once called too much for one man. I smiled. He was right, but not in the way he thought. It was too much. Too much peace for people who live off chaos. Too much strength for those who survive on pity. Some inherit their power, others design it. I had chosen the latter. Before heading back inside, I whispered to the open air, not in anger but in affirmation, "This house remembers." It wasn't about walls anymore. It was about legacy, the kind of legacy that teaches not how to fight but when to refuse. That night I sat at my desk again. Same chair, same lamp, but a different man. The air in the room felt clean, unburdened. No tension hiding in corners. No ghosts of unspoken guilt. Just me, the quiet hum of the clock, and a blank sheet of paper. I picked up my pen, not to plan, not to defend, but to write. For my daughter. For my grandson. The words came slowly at first, heavy with years of silence. "My dear Anna, if you ever read this, know that none of what happened was about anger. It was about recognition. A man spends his life building. Homes, families, futures, and if he's not careful, those things begin to own him instead of him owning them." I paused, remembering her laughter as a child, her small hand holding mine when she was afraid of thunder. Somewhere along the line, love had become duty, and duty had become a leash. "You once told me I was too proud to ask for help. Maybe, but there's a difference between asking for help and surrendering your peace. You learned that letting others walk over you doesn't make you kind, it makes you complicit." I leaned back, took a breath, and continued. "Tell your son, my grandson, that strength isn't in the shouting or the winning. It's in the stillness before a boundary is drawn. It's in the quiet decision to say, 'Enough.' The world will try to convince him that love means tolerance without limits, but real love protects, even when it's misunderstood." My hand trembled slightly as I wrote the last lines. Don't hate him for what he tried to do. He learned it from a world that confuses possession with care. But make sure he learns something better from this, that peace is sacred and those who respect it are the only ones worthy of sharing it. I signed the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope. No address yet, Maybe I'd send it someday, maybe I wouldn't. But it existed. That was enough. As I set the letter aside, I realized that revenge had never been the purpose. Rest. Oration was. The kind of restoration that doesn't rebuild what was broken, but redefines what will never be broken again. The clock struck midnight. Outside, the world slept. Inside, I finally did too, not as a man who had won, but as one who had stopped losing himself. Morning arrived quiet and golden, the kind of light that doesn't just fill a room, it forgives it. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, barefoot, coffee in hand. The air carried that clean stillness after a storm, not emptiness, but renewal. Across the yard, dew clung to the grass like small fragments of memory, shimmering and calm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to prepare, defend, or anticipate. The house, the walls, the silence, they all stood with me now, not against me. I walked slowly to the edge of the porch and looked at the old oak tree by the fence. My wife had planted it the year our daughter was born. It had survived storms, drought, and time. Its roots ran deep, silent, unseen, like strength that doesn't need to announce itself. I realized that's what I had become, not unbreakable, but grounded. As I stood there, I thought about everything that had happened, the manipulation, the confrontation, the reclamation. It all led to one truth that now felt carved into the air itself. Peace is not inherited, it's engineered. You build it, you maintain it, and you defend it, not with walls, but with will. I smiled faintly, almost laughing to myself. All that chaos, all that noise, just to end here. In quiet, in clarity, in freedom. That's the irony of life's little wars. The victory never comes from destroying the enemy, but from rebuilding the self. Before heading back inside, I whispered to the tree, almost like a prayer. Let him learn, let them all learn, that a man who builds peace cannot be moved. Then I closed the door, not to shut the world out, but to keep the peace in. The story didn't end with triumph. It ended with stillness, the kind only earned when you finally understand that revenge isn't payback. It's presence. It's waking up in a house that breathes with you, not against you. It's standing in the quiet and realizing you own it because you earned it. And that morning, as sunlight touched the walls, the house seemed to sigh, as if it too had been waiting for this moment of truth. For the first time in a long time, both the man and the house were finally home. Days passed. The tension that once clung to the house dissolved into something softer, steadiness. Each sunrise no longer felt like survival, it felt like ownership. I moved through the halls slowly, touching the walls, feeling their warmth in my palms. They no longer echoed fear, they resonated with resolve. Peace, I realized, isn't a gift. It's a discipline. Every morning now began with routine, not of defense, but of design. Coffee. A short walk through the garden. Notes in the old leather journal. The one that used to hold sketches of Bildin. GS now held reflections instead, blueprints of the soul. On one page I wrote, "The world respects walls more than words, but walls built with wisdom don't isolate, they protect purpose." It became my quiet mantra. One afternoon, while pruning the vines near the gate, I saw a letter resting in the mailbox, my daughter's handwriting. I paused, heart steady but curious. Inside, just a few words. "Dad, I understand now. I see what you meant. Thank you for teaching without shouting. No apology, no excuses, just acknowledgement, the rarest form of healing." I folded the note carefully, slid it between the pages of my journal, and smiled. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't demand understanding immediately. It waits, patiently, until the world is ready to meet it. That night, I sat beneath the oak tree with a lantern and a blanket of stars above me. The wind moved softly through the branches, carrying the kind of silence that doesn't haunt, it hums. I realized that legacy isn't maya, assured by what we give others, but by what we teach them never to give away. And as I looked up at that endless sky, I whispered to the universe, not as a man tired from battle, but as one reborn from it. May my grandson grow up knowing that kindness has edges and peace has borders. Because in the end, revenge was never the destination. It was just the bridge, the path that carried me back to myself. It was 12 years later when the knock came. Soft, hesitant, but familiar. I opened the door and found a young man standing on the porch. Broad shoulders, sharp eyes, a quiet fire in his stance. My grandson. The boy I hadn't seen since he was 8. He looked older now, not just in years, but in understanding. The kind of understanding that only comes from betrayal. "Grandpa," he said, voice trembling between guilt and need. "Mom said you might not want to see me." I studied him, not with anger but with memory. His mother had once said the same thing decades ago when she saint oohed on this porch with her husband's lies tangled in her tone. I opened the door wider. "Come in, son." He stepped inside, scanning the house the way his father once did. But this was different. His gaze wasn't greedy, it was searching. Long. "I didn't come here for money, Grandpa. I came here for peace." And those words carried more weight than any apology. I leaned forward, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Then you're already richer than your father ever was." Outside, the wind stirred through the oak tree, the same one planted the year his mother was born. Its roots had spread deep, unseen, unbroken. Just like the truth, in that moment I realized something profound. Revenge dies when legacy begins. That night, the house glowed with a different kind of light, not from lamps or lanterns, but from understanding. My grandson sat across the table, the same table where battles of pride and silence once raged. Now it was a place of truth. I poured 2 cups of tea, the steam rising between us like a bridge between generations. "You've been taught to obey," I began quietly, "to blend in, to respect authority even when it disrespects your soul. That's how they train men, not to lead but to comply. But the moment you start asking why, the entire system begins to shake." He leaned forward, intent, listening with the hunger of someone finally hearing what the world had always refused to say aloud. "The greatest control in history," I continued, "was never through chains or wars. It was through belief. Make a man think peace means silence, and he'll never raise his voice again. Convince him that family means obedience, and he'll never walk his own path." His brow furrowed. "That's what Dad always said, that loyalty means doing what you're told." I nodded slowly. "And that's why your father failed. Loyalty isn't submission, it's integrity. It's standing for what's right, even when it means standing alone." I pushed my journal across the table, the one filled with decades of notes, sketches, and reflections. "These aren't blueprints for buildings," I said. "They're blueprints for the mind. Everything I learned about architecture, structure, weight, balance applies to life. You build from the ground up. You reinforce your foundations. You never let others design your walls." He flipped through the pages, eyes wide, reverent. "You wrote all this?" "Yes," I said, "because truth fades when it's not recorded. Lies multiply when silence feeds them." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the same rhythm that had carried through every chapter of this house's life. "Tomorrow," I told him, "we begin your real education. Not what schools teach, not what families preach, but what life hides in plain sight." He looked at me, fire steady in his eyes now. "N is architecture, but not all structures are made of stone." He frowned slightly, curious. I motioned toward the window. "Look out there, the city, the skyline, the neighborhoods. Every building, every system, every rule is designed to shape behavior. Architecture doesn't just contain us, it conditions us." He turned to me, eyes narrowing. "You mean control." "Exactly," I said. "Control isn't about force, it's about design. The most powerful systems don't cage you, they convince you the cage is comfort." I walked slowly across the room, my hand tracing the bookshelf. "Governments build laws, churches build doctrines, corporations build needs, families build expectations. Each one draws walls around your will. And when they tell you it's for your good, you stop questioning why those walls exist in the first place." He wrote furiously, his pen moving like a pulse. "So that's how they keep people obedient?" I nodded. "They trade truth for order. They feed you fear, then sell you safety. They tell you rebellion is sin, and compliance is love. And soon you forget that freedom was ever your natural state." He looked shaken, like a man glimpsing the machinery behind his own reflection. "But how do you fight it?" "You don't fight it," I said quietly. "You outbuild it." He looked up. "How?" "You build within yourself what no institution can reach. Awareness. Awareness is the architecture of sovereignty. Once you see the design, you can't be used by it." The air felt electric now, heavy with truth. "Most men," I said, "live in houses built by others, mental houses, emotional cages. They decorate their prisons with comfort and call it peace. But when you learn to draft your own design, when you become your own architect, the walls stop closing in." My grandson's pen stopped. His gaze met mine. "Then teach me how to build that." I smiled, not softly, but with pride. "Tomorrow we tear down the foundation first." Dawn broke through the curtains like a queen. Truth. Warm, gentle, and undeniable. My grandson was already at the table, notebook open, eyes steady. He was no longer the uncertain boy who'd walked through my door days ago. The fire in him had changed. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was awakening. I set my cup down and began. Before we can build freedom, I said, we must understand how obedience is built, how the blueprint is drawn long before you even learn to speak. He leaned in. You mean in childhood? Yes, I said. Control begins the day you're praised for silence and punished for curiosity. He looked puzzled, so I continued. When a child asks why, he challenges authority. When he accepts because I said so, he begins to surrender his will. That's the first brick in the wall. He nodded slowly, taking notes. Schools continue it, I said. They don't teach children how to think. They teach them what to think. Memorize, repeat, obey. The ones who question too much are labeled troublemakers. The ones who follow blindly are rewarded. That's not education. That's conditioning. I paused, letting that sink in before I added. Religion refines it. It tells you that doubt is sin and faith means submission. And the moment you stop questioning divine authority, you stop questioning human authority too. My grandson looked uneasy now. And families? He asked softly. I smiled sadly. Families are the first and most effective architects of obedience. Out of love, they teach you fear. Fear of shame, fear of disapproval, fear of being unloved. They tell you to behave so you'll be accepted, not realizing they're shaping you into someone who will accept anything to avoid rejection. He leaned back, his jaw tightening. So even love can control? Yes, I said quietly. Especially love, because you'll forgive control when it wears the face of care. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. The truth was landing, reshaping him brick by brick. So, he asked after a long pause, what's the first step to breaking it? Awareness, I said. See the pattern. Trace the walls. Name the design. The moment you recognize the architecture, it begins to crack. He looked out the window, the morning light reflecting in his eyes. Then tomorrow, he said firmly, let's tear it all down. I nodded, a quiet pride swelling in my chest. Tomorrow, I whispered, we start building you, not the boy they wanted, but the man you were meant to be. The next morning the air felt charged, not with calm, but with clarity. My grandson stood by the old oak tree, waiting. He had that look of a man ready to confront something invisible but powerful. I joined him outside, the cold air slicing softly through memory. Today, I said, we don't build, we destroy. He looked startled. Destroy what, Grandpa? Fear, I said simply. Not the kind that protects you from danger, the kind that keeps you from living. We walked along the path that led to the edge of the property, where my late wife had planted her roses decades ago. Fear, I continued, is the oldest tool of control. It doesn't need chains or weapons. It just needs imagination. Once they convince you what might happen, you'll destroy yourself trying to prevent it. He frowned. So fear isn't real? Oh, it's real, I said, but it's often misplaced. You fear failure, not because it hurts, but because you were taught it means shame. You fear rejection, not because it breaks you, but because you were taught it defines you. The trick of control is simple. Make fear feel personal. He was silent, listening deeply. Every generation, I went on, inherits fear. Parents pass it down like heirlooms. Don't risk too much. Don't question too loudly. Don't dream too big. They mean well, but they're just transferring their own cages to their children. He looked at me, eyes sharp now. So how do I stop the chain? I smiled slightly. By doing the one thing fear hates most, exposure. He raised an eyebrow. Expose. You're? Yes, I said. Fear thrives in silence. It dies in sunlight. Speak it, name it, drag it out of the dark corners of your mind. When you say, I'm afraid of being alone, you realize it's not a prophecy, it's a pattern, and patterns can be changed. We stopped by the roses. The wind carried their scent like a memory. I pointed at the thorns. See these? People call them dangerous, but they're just defenses. Fear is the same, not your enemy, but your alarm. Learn what it's warning you about, and it becomes your ally. He smiled faintly, nodding. So fear isn't the enemy. Ignorance is. Exactly, I said. Fear teaches you where to look. Awareness teaches you what to see. The sun rose higher, spilling gold through the branches. Tomorrow, I told him, we start rebuilding from that place. Not from fear, but from knowledge, from strength, from clarity. He looked at me with quiet resolve. Then tomorrow, he said, we build the man who cannot be controlled. And in that moment, I saw it. The continuation of something greater than revenge, greater than redemption. The rebirth of a bloodline, finally unshackled. By the next sunrise, something in my grandson had changed. The fear that once flickered in his eyes had quieted, not vanished, just transformed. It was now a teacher, not a master. He followed me into the study where the old blueprints still lined the walls, the ones I'd once drawn for buildings, not people. But this time, I laid out a different kind of design. Today, I said, we build the foundation of the man you are becoming. He looked curious. You mean identity? Yes, I replied, but not the kind they told you to have. The world teaches you to define yourself by titles, son, student, employee, husband. Those are roles, not roots. When the role ends, the man collapses. What we're building now can't collapse. He leaned forward, ready. I drew a simple line on the page, a foundation. Everything strong begins with one question. I said, what do you stand for when no one is watching? He hesitated. I'm not sure. Good, I said. Doubt means you're no longer pretending. I continued, a man's identity isn't built by what he owns or who he pleases. It's built by what he refuses to compromise. His code. Without that, he'll trade himself for approval 1,000 times before he even realizes he's been sold. He nodded, his expression sharpening. So how do I find my code? By losing everything false, I said. Detach from borrowed values. Question inherited beliefs. Don't ask, what should I do? Ask, does this align with what I truly believe? If it doesn't, walk away. Every time you walk away from what's false, you walk closer to yourself. He wrote that down slowly, each word like a seed taking root. Then I added, and remember this, boundaries are the architecture of identity. A man who cannot say no has no foundation. Every yes must be built on a choice, not fear of conflict. He looked, though. Dad always said saying no made me selfish. Your father was wrong, I said calmly. Selfishness is taking without giving. Boundaries are about knowing your limits so you can give what's real. The world needs more men with edges, not more men who melt under pressure. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak leaves. The same sound that had accompanied every lesson, every loss. I looked at him, the young man who was slowly becoming his own design. Revenge, power, peace, they all start in the same place, I said. Self-mastery. Once you master yourself, no one can use you again. He met my gaze resolute. Then I'll master myself, Grandpa, even if it takes my whole life. I smiled faintly, a proud warmth in my chest. It won't take a life, I said softly. It will give you one. The next day, I found my grandson sitting on the porch before sunrise, still, silent, watching the horizon burn its first line of gold across the dark. I didn't interrupt high. Stillness was rare in young men, rarer still when it came from intention, not exhaustion. When he finally turned toward me, his expression told me he was ready. Grandpa, he said, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about mastering myself. I want to learn how to stay calm no matter what happens. I nodded. Then today we begin the hardest lesson, emotional discipline. He frowned slightly. Isn't that just controlling how you feel? No, I said, walking over to stand beside him. Control is suppression. Discipline is direction. You don't silence your emotions, you teach them when to speak. He looked intrigued. So emotions aren't weakness? Not at all, I said. They're signals, raw energy. Anger shows where boundaries are broken. Sadness shows where something mattered. Fear shows where awareness is missing. The problem isn't the emotion itself, it's the reaction that follows it. I picked up a small stone from the porch and dropped it into a bucket of water nearby. Ripples spread outward. This, I said, pointing, is what happens when someone provokes you. Their words, their actions, they drop a stone into your peace. The weak man reacts to the ripples. The strong man studies the stone. He stared at the water, mesmerized. So strength is observation? Exactly, I said. The world will always test you. With disrespect, lies, betrayal, people will try to pull you into their storms because they can't handle your calm. But when you learn to pause, to breathe, to see instead of react, you take away their power. He nodded slowly, letting the idea sink in. That's hard to do in the moment, he admitted. It is, I said. That's why we train. Every day, find one thing that bothers you, and don't respond right away. Watch your emotion rise and fade like a tide. When you realize you are not the wave, but the ocean beneath it, that's when calm becomes strength. The morning light had climbed higher now, painting everything and quiet gold. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember this," I said softly. "A man who controls others may seem powerful, but a man who controls his reaction, he is untouchable." He smiled, the kind of quiet smile that comes from understanding, not pride. "Then I'll train my stillness, Grandpa, until nothing can move me but truth." I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I saw not the shadow of his father, but the light of something new, a legacy reborn not through vengeance but wisdom. By the following dawn my grandson's posture had changed, straighter, grounded, no longer searching for approval in my eyes. That was the first sign the lessons were working. He wasn't becoming me, he was becoming himself. When he joined me at the table, I laid a single chess piece in front of him, a king. "Today," I said, "we learn how to see." He studied the piece. "See what?" "Everything," I replied. "People, motives, patterns. The invisible game that's always being played. Yet around you, you cannot master life until you understand its players." He leaned in, intrigued. I continued, "Every person you meet is either building with you or feeding off you, but most can't tell which is which, because they're too emotional to observe. That's why yesterday's stillness matters. Without it, perception is clouded." He nodded, quiet. I drew a small diagram on the table with my finger. "Here's the truth: manipulation isn't always malicious, it's just awareness used without empathy. People manipulate out of fear, insecurity, or need. The key isn't to hate them, it's to recognize their patterns before they reach your peace." He frowned slightly. "So, you're saying I should read everyone?" "Yes," I said, "but not to judge, to understand. Watch their eyes when they speak." Continued, "Don't believe kindness too quickly. Manipulators use warmth as camouflage. They'll mirror your values until you drop your guard. Then they'll test how much of yourself you'll trade to keep the peace." He looked up, eyebrows drawn together. "So, how do you deal with them?" "Two ways," I said. "With empathy if they can learn, with distance if they can't. Never try to fix someone who benefits from being broken. That's not compassion, it's self-destruction." He took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "So awareness isn't about control, it's protection." I smiled faintly. "Exactly. Awareness doesn't change others, it keeps them from changing you." He turned the chess piece in his hand, thoughtful. "And this?" he asked. I gestured toward it. "That's the king, the slowest piece yet the most important. Because power isn't speed, it's presence. A king never rushes. He moves only when necessary. That's how you lead, with observation first, decision second." The wind brushed tea through the window, scattering a few papers across the floor. He bent to pick them up, but I stopped him with a gesture. "Let them fall," I said. "Some things aren't meant to be fixed, just understood." He straightened, smiling slightly. "You're teaching me how to see the board before I play." I nodded. "Exactly. Because the man who sees wins, even when he walks away." The evening was still, soaked in amber light. My grandson and I sat by the fire, not as teacher and student anymore, but as two men walking the same road at different points in time. He had learned to listen without reacting, to see without judgment. Now it was time to understand how to move without noise. "Today," I said, "you learn the laws of quiet power, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't threaten, but still changes the room when it enters." He nodded, focused. "Power," I began, "isn't about making others bend. It's about standing so firmly in who you are that the world adjusts around your presence. The we seek control through words and aggression, the strong influence through silence and consistency." He frowned slightly. "So silence is power?" "When it's chosen," I replied. "Forced silence is submission. Chosen silence is strategy." I leaned forward, my voice low. "Listen carefully. The loudest man in the room is usually the most afraid. Real strength never argues. It observes, understands, and decides when speaking serves purpose, not ego." He wrote those words down slowly, then asked, "What about influence? How do you lead people without controlling them?" "By example," I said simply. "When people see calm in chaos, they follow. When they see integrity where others cheat, they trust. True power is not about convincing, it's about embodying." He nodded thoughtfully, and I continued, "Never chase respect. Command it through your behavior. Never beg for loyalty. Earn it through fairness, and never let emotions decide your moves. Let principles do that, because one man ruled by emotion can destroy everything he built in a moment of rage." He was quiet for a long while, watching the fire dance in reflection on his notebook. Then he said softly, "It's strange. I used to think power meant control, but now it feels more like peace." I smiled faintly. "Exactly. The highest form of power isn't dominance, it's composure. Anyone can fight, few can remain still." The fire cracked softly between us. The boy who once trembled at his father's voice now sat unshaken by the truth of the world. I saw it then, the full circle. "Tomorrow," I said, "we'll finish the final lesson, the legacy of strength. After that you won't need me anymore." He looked at me, his voice low. "I'll always need you, Grandpa." I shook my head gently. "No, son. You'll carry me, not need me. That's the difference." Morning came quietly, the kind of silence that feels sacred, not empty, but full. The fire had burned to embers, and the world outside was a soft gold. My grandson was already awake, sitting at the table with his journal open, his pen waiting. He didn't need prompting anymore. He knew this was the last lesson. I poured 2 cups of coffee, placed one in front of him, and sat down. "Every man," I began, "leaves something behind. But not all men leave themselves behind. Most pass down their fears, their failures, their debts. Few pass down their wisdom, their strength, their calm." He listened closely, his eyes steady now, no longer the restless boy from months ago. "What do you want me to leave behind?" he asked quietly. I looked into his face, the reflection of every generation before me, shaped by pain, sharpened by truth. "Not my words," I said. "My silence, my patience, my understanding of when to act and when to walk away. Leave behind the kind of man who doesn't need to be seen to be felt." He wrote that down slowly. The sound of pen against paper felt like a ritual. "You see," I continued, "men like your father and men like I once was, we thought control meant safety. But control is just fear-wearing armor. What keeps you safe isn't power over others, it's mastery over yourself." The fire popped softly, a punctuation mark in the stillness. I reached into my jacket and took out a small brass compass, old and worn. The glass was scratched, but the needle still moved true. "This belonged to my father," I said. "He carried it through war, through loss, through the kind of nights that could break a man. He gave it to me when I was your age. Now it's yours." His hand trembled as he took it. "Does it still work?" I smiled faintly. "It always points north, but that's not why it matters. It's a reminder that no matter how far you go, you must always know where you are." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I'll never lose it." "You will," I said softly, "one day. But by then you won't need it anymore." He looked down, silent. The compass gleamed in his palm like a tiny heart of metal. I could see it, the transformation come. Complete. The boy who once feared becoming his father was now something far beyond either of us. I stood slowly, every movement heavy with years. "Remember this," I said. "The world will always test your boundaries. People will try to guilt you, to break you, to make you doubt your right to peace. When that happens, you'll feel my voice in your blood, steady, calm, reminding you, no one enters unless you open the gate." He rose too, eyes wet but fierce. "I understand, Grandpa." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then the legacy is yours." Outside, the wind stirred, soft, then strong. It moved through the trees across the field, and for the first time in years I felt light. As I turned to leave the room, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The line of strength had been rebuilt, not through dominance, but through clarity, not through control, but through freedom. And somewhere deep inside that quiet house, a young man whispered the phrase we had spoken halfway through our journey. Twice, to seal the transformation forever. "I am unshaken. I am awake." The legacy of strength wasn't a story anymore. It was alive, breathing through him. They thought it was just about a house, 4 walls, a driveway, a gate. But it was never about bricks or space. It was about ownership. Not of property, but of self. The day my son-in-law tried to move his parents into my home without permission, he didn't understand what he was really doing. He wasn't invading a building. He was testing a boundary, one every man must face in his lifetime, the boundary between peace and submission, between being helpful and being harvested, between family loyalty and self-betrayal. And when I said no, I didn't just defend my home, I reclaimed my sovereignty. That word scares people because it's not loud, it's not rebellious, it's quiet, absolute, and unbreakable. You see, the world is full of Corneliuses, charming faces that smile while measuring what they can take. They speak of family, of duty, of fairness. But what they really want is your energy, your space, your silence. They don't want partnership. They want possession. And for years, I gave it freely. Until I realized something they never taught us. When you say no from truth, you don't lose love. You lose control that was never love to begin. Now the house is quiet again. But the quiet is different. Not empty, not lonely. It's the quiet of a man who has finally aligned his inner architecture with his outer world, every wall, every door, every breath, his design, his order, his peace. So, to every man watching this, if you've ever been made to feel guilty for guarding your space, remember this story. You are not cold for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for choosing peace. You are the architect of your own freedom. And once you build that, no one moves in without your permission again. Beat, fade to silence, faint wind sound, then screen text. I am unshaken. I am awe.